Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Matt from Matt's Bookshelf, and today I'm talking about a book for the first time in a while, and that book is William Gaddis's The Recognitions. I started reading this book around mid-February, and 2 months later, I finished this 900-plus page book, and man, was this a journey that was completely worth the long and arduous struggle to get it completed. So, The Recognitions my edition is from the NYRB, and this book is largely considered to be like a overlooked classic among many people. There are some articles out in like early 2020 around the pandemic time where like some literary critics are like finally acknowledging like the brilliance of this book. And William Gaddis is very much like an expat writer, like in the fashion of Hemingway or Fitzgerald or a James Joyce, but in a different time period. He spent a lot of his young life from like from his early 20s to his early 30s traveling the world and writing The Recognitions. This book took 9 years to make, and it's relatively unknown, I think, at least among like more casual readers, so I kind of want to do a video on the book to sort of give it a little more exposure and to give my thoughts on the book for those who have read it and maybe want to discuss more about the book. And I actually had never heard of this book until a couple months ago, and why I discovered this book has a lot to do with the plot. So I'll get into like the general background of the story. I won't go into any spoilers yet. I'll make it very clear when I go into spoilers. But just as a general blurb, I guess, for what the plot is based around, is that it follows a character named Wyatt, who is the son of a reverend from a Calvinist church in New England, and he travels to Europe, to different countries in Europe, and then back to New York for various reasons, because he wants to become an artist. He wants to break away from the church and become an artist, but he finds very early on that he can't make money doing his own work. So he makes a Faustian deal with a businessman named Rectal Brown, who basically employs him to make copies of classic works of art and then to sell them as the real copies. So they're in a scheme. They're doing an illegal scheme, and the book basically follows the emotional toll for Wyatt because he's very passionate about art, but he also needs money to continue making his art. So he's sort of in this conundrum. So he's making money doing these illegal things, but at the same time it's affecting him morally because he knows he's a fraud to a certain extent. He's not doing what is fulfilling for him. And in addition to that, it follows other characters in this New York setting. A writer named Otto, a musician named Stanley, and a bunch of other people who are all in this quote-unquote friend group. They all kind of get into various arguments through. It's not like Friends, the TV show. Like they're basically all kind of hate each other to a certain extent. But it's basically an exploration of what it means to be recognized as an artist, or what your legacy will be, and what man's relationship is with God or some sort of divine influence, spirituality. What exists, what doesn't exist, and you get many characters' different impressions of what's going on. So I discovered this book thanks to my friend Drunzo, or Marcus. I know him because last November 2021, I went to Spain, and I went to Valencia in Madrid. And so I was talking to my friend Mark, and he was like, "Oh, have you ever read The Recognitions?" I'm like, "No, I never read that. I don't know what that is." He goes, "Oh, it's about like an American from the East Coast who travels to Spain to like pursue art." I'm like, "That's like basically what I did a couple months ago." And he actually read it earlier, and he talked about it, but like it kind of like went in one ear, went out the other for me. And then when he brought it up again after I came back from Spain, I was like, "Man, I should like really check out this book, because like this is kind of like what I did just a few months ago." Not when I read the book, it turns out it's like basically not at all what I did. But the general consensus was like, "Oh man, like a guy who's like from around the same area as me going to Spain, and yeah, like that sounds really sick." So I bought the book, not realizing how long it was, and then I realized it was 900 something pages long. But that was like how I first discovered the book, was through word of mouth from my friend. And yeah, this is my first ever time reading Gaddis. I'd never heard of him, really, until Adrenzo pointed it out to me. And now that I finished the book, I'm really excited to read more of Gaddis, because this book will be on my mind for a very, very long time. So with that said, let's get into some of the text. Again, I will make it very clear when I'm getting into really big spoilers, but what I was talking about for the first initial sections are just, very, very early on in the book. So first things first, I want to make it clear that I had a difficult time with this book in many sections, but I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. It's very much akin to Ulysses by James Joyce in many ways, which I'll get into a Ulysses discussion later on. I know some people are going to wait till you write your comments because I'm going to talk about in comparison to Ulysses later on, but it's very much in the vein of Ulysses where it has that stream of consciousness writing style for much of it. A lot of references to religious characters and events that, if you don't study the Bible, you probably haven't heard of. And also it sort of like transitions from omnipotent narrator to like character narrator without really making it clear. So you have to sort of distinguish is this scene being described from the perspective of Wyatt? Is this scene being described from the perspective of Stanley? Is it being described by like an omnipotent narrator? So things like that will become difficult at points. But but ultimately I'm glad that I read it, and I'm kind of okay with being challenged in my work, in what I read, because as I talked about in one of my really earlier videos with The Great Gatsby, I noticed a lot of people commenting on that book saying like, oh, it's pretentious, it's too hard to read sometimes. And I wonder what your qualifications are for something being too hard to read. Is rereading a section considered too hard to read? Are you so used to just reading a page and not having to go back to reread elements of that page in order to fully understand it, that whenever you have to reread, you feel like your intellect is being tested, and that makes you angry? So I don't really understand that criticism, because there were plenty of sections that I had to reread for this book, and I'll go into more of that when I get into the spoiler section of this video. But I reread a lot of this book to get a better understanding of it, and I don't see it as a test or a challenge to my intellect. I'm glad that there's a book out there that wants me to reread it, that wants to challenge me in my ability to comprehend text, because as a writer, it improves my ability to write, and it tests my knowledge of what writing can be and what prose, the scope of what prose can reach. And I don't see it as a challenge or as a insult, the author is purposely trying to make it vague and nebulous to insult my character, insult my intelligence. I'm just if I have to reread sections, it's fine. I don't really care. And it honestly makes me more excited to reread the book more than anything, because now knowing better about what the book is and the plot elements, maybe I'll be able to understand the more minute details as I reread it, because I'm not so focused on trying to understand the plot. And William Gass, in his afterword for the book, makes some pretty funny points about the difficulty of this book, and I'll read those sections as followed. While it was ambition, certainly, dense, lengthy, complex, its author is a romantic in that regard, clearly concerned to create a masterpiece, for how else but by aiming is excellence to be attained. It's not often one begins a sandcastle on a lazy summer morning, patty baking by a blue lagoon, only to, by gosh, achieve thanks to a series of serenities and Alhambra with all its pools by afternoon. The book was about bamboozlers. The slowest wits could see that, and therein saw themselves, and therewith withdrew. This was not to be a slow evening's soporific entertainment. It was to be their indecent exposure. So that is a criticism to the critics who originally panned the recognitions when it first came out. Gass is calling them out, saying oh, you just didn't understand it. You felt like you were being challenged, and that's why you gave it bad reviews. You're expecting an easy book, and William Gaddis did not give you an easy book. He gave you something that challenged you, and the frauds that are in the recognitions, they saw too much of themselves in those fraudulent characters, and then therefore were turned away from the book. Gass then goes on to say, too often we bring to literature the bias for realism. We were normally brought up with, consequently, we find a work like the recognitions too fanciful, obscure, and riddling. But is reality always clear and unambiguous? Is reality simple and not complex? Does it unfold like the pages of a newspaper, or is the unfolding more like that of a roadmap? Difficult to get spread out, difficult to read, difficult to redo. And is everything remembered precisely and nothing repeated? And are people we know inexplicably lost from sight for long periods, only to pop up when we least expect them? Of course, the traditional realist, well-scrubbed world, where motives are known and actions are unambiguous, where you can believe what you are told, and where the paths of good and evil are as clearly marked as highways. That world is as contrived as a can opener. For all their frequent brilliance and all the fondness we have for these artificial figures, their clever conversations and fanciful parties, the plots they circle in like carouseled horses, to call them and the world they decorate real is to embrace a beloved illusion. The pages of the recognitions are more nearly the real night thing than any of Zola's or Balzac's. Again, Gass is being very witty here, saying like, real life is very messy, and like the recognitions emulates real life because, there's no clear narrative to one's own life, just like how there's no clear narrative to the recognition. People pop up at random points in your life when you don't expect it. Random things will happen to you for seemingly no reason at all. And again, I think he's kind of lashing out at the critics who criticize this book to begin with, because the recognition is bold and daring. And as I said earlier about challenging prose, there's something very noble about making something that's challenging. But that being said, I will get a little bit into the abstract elements of the recognitions. And a slight problem that I had is that maybe at points it was a little too abstract, not in the sense that I feel like I'm being challenged, but there are some major plot elements that are described in a very nebulous way that I do think could have been more effective had Gaddis, taken his foot off the gas a little bit and described it in a more easy way, in a more just like predictable way or what have you. But those scenes are very far and few between, and on a reread, I'm completely open-minded to having those my views on these scenes changed or challenged, because but just on my first read, like there are some parts where I'm like, when I'm going through like summaries of the book, I'm like, wait, that happened? I'm like, could he have just described it in a slightly more easy way? Is he being purposefully obtuse just for being obtuse's sake? But, again, I'm completely willing to have those opinions changed on a reread. And before I get into the spoiler section, if someone is watching this and they have reservations about reading this book due to its length or its difficulty, this is not like this is a stuffy novel in a lot of ways, but it's not entirely stuffy. Gaddis is very experimental with both tone and writing style. And as I said earlier with the characters, like there's like a ton of characters in this book, and each one has different perspective on the nature of art, the nature of being recognized, or what your legacy will be, what the purpose of life is, what role God or religion plays in it. And the conversations they have are very, engaging, and they help make the book fly by because they all have very unique perspectives. And you can tell Gaddis put a lot of effort into like really, uncovering, really getting into the heart of like different perspectives on these very nebulous concepts that people today, we've all probably had discussions or debates on politics, religion, art, in our own lives, and they very much reflect in this book. They feel very realistic. Like, for example, the Rectal Brown character, who's the businessman, probably doesn't share very similar viewpoints to Gaddis himself, but his character and his perspectives are very unique, and it helps identify him as a character, and it shows like, and it also conversely makes characters like Wyatt stand out even more for like his attempted purity or his sort of tragic romantic viewpoints on art. And I'm just gonna read like a really small section of that right here. Money gives significance to anything. Yes, people believe that, don't they? People believe that. Rectal Brown watched patiently, like someone waiting for a child to solve a simple problem, to which there was only one answer. The cigarette lit across from him, knit them together in the different textures of their smoke. St. Paul tells us to redeem time. Does he? Rectal Brown's tone was gentle and encouraging. A work of art redeems time, and buying it redeems money, Rectal Brown said. Again, Rectal Brown he has a very unique perspective on what the purpose of art is. And it feels so fulfilled. It feels so genuine and honest, despite the fact that I don't think Gaddis would agree with Rectal Brown. But he's able to portray it in a way where it's like Rectal Brown is like a villain, but he's not like a clear punching bag for Gaddis to take his angers out on. He's a very well-developed character, and it helps make the recognitions, the world of the recognitions, the recognition cinematic universe feels so much more lived in because all these characters are so diverse and interesting. And not just the characters, but the writing style and the tone switches as well. There are some like legitimately hilarious scenes in recognitions. And I think William Gaddis originally described this book as being like a black comedy, and was kind of surprised by how seriously people took the novel to begin with. But there are some really funny scenes, especially with the character Otto, who is like the Gaddis character to a certain extent. He is a playwright who's trying to get his first play published, and he goes through a lot of like really kind of sardonically funny moments in order, like in his his adventure and his path and his journey to get this book published. And I'm going to read one of those sections here when he's in Spain and he cannot seem to find his manuscript anywhere, so he has to ask some of like the workers in the hotel if they saw it, but the workers only speak Spanish, and I'm going to read that scene as follows as he tries to communicate them in his broken Spanish. Hai visto una manuscripta aquí? Otto had made up the word manuscripta. One of the triumphs of his stay was a successful evasion of learning more than some 30 mispronounced words of the language. ¿Qué dijo? La manuscripta de mi playa, said Otto forcefully. He knew that by adding a, he could translate any English noun satisfactorily. The ladies were vastly confused. He turned from the doorway and set off toward the building. They followed. ¿Qué dijo de playa? Asked one, drawn on by the mystery of a man looking for a beach. None tried to answer her. They tramped up the dirt in silence. Inside his room, Otto turned on the woman who had admitted to cleaning it. El está para la máquina, he said, pointing to the typewriter. Esta mañana? Perdido, said one woman, satisfied that something was lost. Sí, perdido, said another, equally agreeable. She started to look under the mattress. ¿Qué cosa? Asked the accused bravely. Papel, said the master. Papel que yo escribo mi playa al máquina, finishing the triumphal confusion. Mi playa, he repeated, menacing. Es muy misteriosa, said one of the women. Sí, muy misteriosa, repeated the third, while the fourth let go the mattress. It was where she would have hidden anything, and stood silently marveling at this man who had lost a beach right here in the room. And although I know what playa means before I went to Spain, there are definitely moments where you're struggling to communicate with people and you kind of just add a or o at the end of words. Especially because I also study Italian as well. There are times in Italian class where it's you don't know what to say and you just kind of you add something that you add a vowel to the end of an English word and just hope that makes sense. And sometimes it does, but in this case with Otto, playa, he's trying to say play, but again, the Spanish women are how do you miss a beach in your room? So really funny things like that, and that's kind of prevent the novel from being too dour or too stuffy, if you will. And also, the writing style itself changes as well. I'm going to throw this out there. William Gaddis is an excellent poetry writer. There's a character named Esme who is a muse character, and she's also a poet, and some of her poems do show up in this text. A couple of them show up, and I'm imagining they're written by Gaddis, but those poems are actually really well written as well. And I'm going to read one of them right here because it's my favorite of the poems. Heaven's crown, brown bought, fell lightly on his brow, lay heavy on her perspicacious now. Still on the dreadful teeth of time she trod, and marveled at the maleness of God. Sweet Nora, wine biscuit, bedewed with sleep, awoke with decorated painting heat. Of present woman could she doubt her sin, sought furiously for the flame within, presented in a naked leaping cry, the burning plunder of the present eye. Pride drew her garments up, and swathed her face, in lineaments incapable of disgrace. Slipped then away her face bedewed with dew, beyond the glass, and knowing all she knew, that the immortals have their ash cans too. And this is great characterization. I mean, it's giving you context of who Esme is as a character without, Gaddis saying, oh, Esme is a deep thinking poet who, thinks a lot about her position and compared to God and all that. No, you get that just from the poem itself. And if Gaddis has a collection of poems anywhere, I couldn't find any, but if he has any sort of poetry book or something that I could read, let me know, because these poems in this book I think are actually incredible. And maybe even more incredible when you think of the context of he's writing the poem from a character's perspective. It's not his. I'm sure there are elements of him in the poems, but he's writing them from a character, and they're still so brilliant. And it's one of those things where it's a really pretty common writing trope where it's if you say that this character is the best at doing blank, you need to back it up. If this character is a brilliant physicist, the author writing the book needs to know a lot about science in order to back up that claim that this man is brilliant. And the same thing with poetry. Esme is a great poetry writer, but if Gaddis couldn't write poetry himself, that character trait would come out as hollow. But because the poems are great, without Gaddis telling you that Esme is a great writer and a great poet. And just one more section before we get into spoilers, I want to read it's another example of prose that I really love from this book. And in addition to, great dialogue, Gaddis is also really great at description. And they're sort of described like paintings in themselves. And I'm going to read one of those sections here because I don't know, it just is more examples of how diverse of a writer William Gaddis is. 7 celestial fabrics, 7 spheres, the colors of the 7 planetary bodies, all these resolved above the flower cart. Above 7th heaven, we are told, there are 7 seas of light, and then the veils separating the substances, 7 of each kind, and then paradise. 7 stages, one above the other, canopied by the throne of the compassionate, discreetly remote from the tumult going on here in the middle distance. The lights charged, traffic moved in waves of figures crested with faces dumbly unbroken or spotted with the foam of confusion, or shattering their surfaces with speech, ebbed and flowed on a sea of noise, disdaining the music of the spheres. The moment of evening lost is suggested in restricted portions of the sky, which only suggest infinity, and that such an intimacy is possible when something rises from inside, to be skewed on the peaks of, or continue to rise untrammeled. A desperate moment for those with nowhere to go, the ones who lose their balance when they look up, passing on all sides here, invited nowhere, enjoying neither drink nor those they drank with, but suddenly desolated. Glancing up, stepping down from the curb alone, to seek anywhere, having forgot to make a date for cocktails, asylum of glass, brittle words, olives from across the sea, and chromium, a place to escape this transition from day to night, a grotesque time of loneliness, for what has been sought is almost visible and requires perhaps no more than a priest to bring it forth. Restricted from the 7 lilies, the sky lay in such a portion of the Etruscan priest might have graced with his wand. When building the temple, he outlined the sky, the foundation at his feet, delivering the residence of deity to earth. And with that, we're going into the spoiler section of this video. I hope that if you haven't read the book, that the video so far has encouraged you to maybe pick it up. But now we are fully into spoiler territory, so let's begin with Basil, one of the more memorable characters in the recognitions. And this scene comes from towards the end of the book. It's one of Basil's last scenes, actually, where it's after Rectal Brown is dead, and Wyatt in his delirious state encounters him, and they Basil has his hand cut. Basil has his nose broken, I think, after a fight with Rectal, and he reveals that a piece of art that they've been trying to sell was actually the real copy of it, the real version that was shipped away without Basil telling anyone. So Wyatt is basically defending a copy as being like the real thing when actually it wasn't. And this conversation is really interesting because we get more insight on Basil's view of art. He's usually pretty against what Rectal Brown has been doing in his schemes, and it shows that he ultimately kind of gets an advantage in the end. But when you look at really amazing pieces of art, you think of like the creation of Adam from by Michelangelo in the Sistine Chapel, which I have seen in person, and you don't really question like, oh, this is a magnificent work of art. Obviously it's Michelangelo. It's the creation of Adam. It's one of the most iconic. It's one of the most iconic versions. It's one of the most iconic paintings ever created. But Basil has an alternate perspective, one that I never really considered before, and I'll read the section as follows, and then I'll go a little bit more into like the context of it. Vulgarity, cupidity, and power. Is that what frightens you? Is that all you see around you, and you think it was different then? Flanders in the 15th century. Do you think it was all like the adoration of the mystic lamb? What about the paintings we've never seen? The trash that's disappeared, just because we have a few masterpieces left? Do you think they were all masterpieces? What about the pictures we've never seen and never will see, that were as bad as anything that's ever been done? And your precious Van Eyck, do you think he didn't live up to his neck in a loud, vulgar court? In a world where everything was done for the same reasons everything is done now, for vanity and avarice and lust, and the boundless egoism of these Chancellor Rolands, do you think they knew the difference between what was bizarre and what was beautiful? What their vulgar ostentation didn't stifle beauty everywhere, the way it's doing today. Yes, damn it, listen to me now and swear by all that's ugly. Do you think any painter did anything but hire himself out? These fine altarpieces, do you think they glorified anyone but vulgar men who commissioned them? Do you think if Van Eyck didn't curse having to whore away his genius to waste his talents on all sorts of vulgar celebrations at the mercy of people he hated? And so Basil addresses a point that I've never really considered before, and it's the fact that many of the iconic paintings we think of today were just driven by like the ego of ambitious men employing struggling artists to create these paintings. And that's exactly what the creation of Adam is. Michelangelo, detested the Catholic Church. And if you go into the deeper meanings of that painting with, God being circled around in the brain, you get you understand that he was not, this is not something he probably would have wanted to make to begin with, but he had to because he was a struggling artist and because he was employed by the Catholic Church who were going to give him money. And the bishops and the leaders of the Catholic Church, had egos themselves that they wanted to fulfill. And so, in a way, we are sort of just admiring the ego of, egotists. We are admiring the ego of patrons who weren't artists themselves. And we think, what could Michelangelo have done if he had the financial means to do it? If he wasn't struggling, if he had, the luxury of having income separately from his patrons, what could have been made? And it makes you think, something like Pablo Picasso's Guernica, which, as far as I know, was made, from, his own drive. Is that a better piece of art because it was made solely from the artist's own ambition than something like The Creation of Adam, because The Creation of Adam was basically, a job for Michelangelo? So things like that are just, one of the many quotes, this one specifically, just blew my mind as to, the nature of art. It's what do I know about art that makes the Sistine Chapel great? Is it great because I'm being told it's great, because it's old, because it's in the Vatican? I don't know. Is that why I think it's great? It's just a mind-blowing moment that, has stuck with me since I read this section. And of course, I would be remiss if I didn't talk about Spain, since that was the reason why I read this book in the first place. And and as if you're at this section, you probably have read the book by now. I was not expecting Wyatt to finally get to Spain by page 750, I think. I thought he'd be in Madrid a lot earlier, but so I was a little disappointed from that. But then when I actually got to the section, I was blown away by it, and you can tell Gaddis loves travel, and specifically he loves Spain. And I have to agree with a lot of his impressions, which I'll read some of his prose about Spain to begin with. But I have a friend in Spain, and people have talked about Spain a lot to me who have been there, and they say, oh, it's a great place, you're going to love it if you go. I never really understood why. I was always open-minded to go to it, but for me, I was always I want to go to Italy, I want to go to, Spain was never a huge destination for me. And then I went, and it's one of my favorite places I've ever been to now. It's just an incredible place, incredible culture, even more incredible food, and just so much history. And I've only seen a small chunk of it, and I feel it's a place I could go back to countless times. It's truly a special country, a special variety of cultures. There's not just one Spanish culture. There's multiple, and a lot of this passion towards Spain in this book, I could relate to heavily, and I want to read some sections there because as an aspiring expat, it really just clicks with me emotionally. So this section comes when the characters first come to Spain. Basically, Spain is a land to flee across. Every town and every capital is a destination, and the names which ring with refuge to the fugitive mounts, with finality to him traveling relentlessly unpursued, setting destinations one after another, whose reasons for being or cease upon arrival. He must move on to provide the interim of purpose with which each new destination endows the journey, however short. The search, each pause with reasons anxiously mistaken, drawing near with each destination to the last. Trains do not depart, they set out. They move at a pace to enhance the landscape and aggrandize the land they traverse, laboring their courses with the efforts of journeys never before made, straining the attention on sufferance of minutes passed separately until concentration is exhausted and no other pace conceivable. And here's just one other quote I want to read about Spain. This comes from the character Mr. Sinistera talking to Wyatt. And they're going by different names at this point, but just for simplicity's sake, these are the characters who are talking. Why, in this country, you could just sail on like that without ever leaving its boundaries. It's not a land you travel in. It's a land you flee across, from one place to another, from one port to another, like a sailor's wet life, where one destination becomes the same as another, and every voyage the same as the one before it, because every destination is only another place to start with. In this country, without ever leaving Spain, a whole Odyssey within its boundaries, a whole Odyssey without Ulysses. Listen. And that's just another perfect description of Spain. It's literally a place you could travel to your whole life. It's basically, you could go on your own odyssey throughout Spain and find something new every location you go to. Like when I was driving from Valencia to Madrid, we went through like these like mountainous green hills to like red clay, red rock valleys, and then finally it's like this crazy city. It with like mountains out in the distance. It's just such a wonderful place. I can't really describe it any other way. You have to go to really understand it. And Gaddis just perfectly captures it, in my opinion. It really just rings true to me. Yeah. And speaking of the Odyssey, at this point, this is when the book was really beginning to click to me. So at this point of the book, as you probably know, because if you're watching this part of the video, you probably read the book. This is when Wyatt is probably at his lowest point. He's living in like a small church in Madrid, and he encounters like a writer who is traveling around Spain to try to get into like this like religious mood because he's writing a religious novel, and he has this revelation towards the end because he's only cut off from society for the most part. And before that, when he's in Spain with Sinistera, he forms a relationship with a prostitute named Pastora, and at this point, he compares her. At this point, I'm going to read the text right now, and this is when the book was starting to make sense to me, and this is basically when Wyatt was having his turning point, when he starts to realize that he's not just his paintings, he's individual person. A daughter, yes, and born out of, not love, but born out of love. When it happened, the bearing, the present reshaped the past. And the suitor? Oh, Christ, not slaying the suitors, no, never, but to supersede where they failed, lie down where they left, where they lost their best moments, and went on to confess them in repetition somewhere else, without living them through where they happened, trying to reshape the future without daring to reshape the past. Oh, the lives, what are lost in confession. I'm bleeding, to run back, looking for every one of them. Every one of them, no, it's too easy. Penelope spinning a web somewhere and tearing it out at night and waiting, or to marry someone else's mistake, to atone for one of your own somewhere else. Dull and dead the day begins. You'd see, listen, 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 here, and the prospect of sin draws us on, but the sin is only boring and dead the moment it happens. It's only the living it through that redeems it. And this is his revelation. So this prostitute, Pastora, who he has a relationship with, he kind of abandons her, I guess, when she's pregnant. And at this point, like, I was reading these sections because this is when he's doing his schemes with Mr. Sinistera, and I was kind of like lost as to really what was going on. And suddenly we get this the Odyssey comparison where Stephen is Odysseus and Pastora is Penelope. So I was rereading some sections, and you realize through rereading it, again going back to the why it's good to reread sections. I was like, man, okay, I was understanding, like, they do have a connection. There's a scene where Mr. Sinistera is, like, asking, like, oh, how much are you paying Pastor to, like, sleep with her every night? And he goes, like, oh, like, he stopped paying, I stopped having to pay her, like, a while ago. And, it sort of clicks, and the recognitions being a very, like, grounded novel to a certain extent, it makes sense that, like, like the epic of the Odyssey in a smaller, more realistic form is like some struggle. Like, Odysseus isn't a Greek hero, he's a struggling author. I mean, he's a struggling painter, and Penelope isn't like this beautiful, like, Greek, like, noble lady. She's a prostitute in Madrid, but like the love is still there, and that is, and the prospect of having a daughter to take care of is what snaps Wyatt or Stephen out of his his trance of just like dour morbidity. And it ends there with him, so we don't know if he ever manages to find them, but at least, he says, like, oh, life is, do you just wallow in your misery, or do you live it out? Do you just lock yourself away, or do you, attempt to keep living and, learn from your mistakes, is how I interpreted it. And I think it's really brilliant. And, rereading those sections that didn't really click with me the first time I read them, and rereading them again, like, they took on new form, and that's, like, the power of this book. They say earlier on that he, when he's talking to this author, that he goes to Algiers, I think, to like fight in some war, and like that's like his Iliad. Like he's literally Odysseus going to Troy to fight, and then coming home. Like it's perfect and it's brilliant, and I don't know, I really enjoyed that. And then again, like there's so many like filled relationships in the recognitions, and it's nice to see like one like might have a spark of potentially being pure and long lasting and perhaps beneficial for Wyatt in the long run. And that leads me to like the end of this video. Just some lingering questions I want to talk about before I wrap the video up, because it's a very, very long video, but this is a very, very long book, so it makes sense. I want to talk about the last page in the recognitions, in which, as you know, it's Stanley's death, and I want to read that section as followed, because I think it's pretty brilliant, and I have some small questions about it as well. Stanley came on, head bowed, closely attending the words he did not understand, as he seated himself and touched the keys, pulling out one stop and another as he listened, and why the priest shook his head and pushed two of them back as he spoke. Stanley did not understand, and he pulled them back out when the priest was gone, apparently in a hurry to be off somewhere before the next service called him back. Prego, Fracchia, attenzione, non usi troppo I bassi, le note bassi, la chiesa è così vecchia che le vibrazioni, capisci, potrebbero essere pericoloso. Per favore, non bassi e non strane combinazioni di note, capisci? When he was left alone, when he had pulled out one stop after another, for the work required it, Stanley straightened himself on the seat, tightened the knot of the red necktie, and struck. The music soared around him from the corner of his eye. He caught the glitter of his wrist watch, and even as he read the music before him and saw his thumb and the last finger come down time after time with three black keys between them, ringing out fourths, the work had copied, coming over the Conte di Brescia, ringing that chord of the devil's interval from the full length of the 30-foot bass pipes. He did not stop. The walls quivered. Still, he did not hesitate. Everything moved, and even falling soared in atonement. He was the only person caught in the collapse, and afterward most of his work was recovered too, and it is still spoken of when it is noted with high regard, though seldom played. So that's the last page of the recognition. This is when Stanley, he finally gets his job, working for a church as a musician, and in Rome, because he travels to Rome, and the priest says, the walls are old, of the church are old, and you can't play the notes too low or it's going to crumble, and that's exactly what happens. And they say he can't understand Italian, but, because I have some knowledge of Italian, when I read it, I was like, oh, that's kind of weird. I understood what he was saying, and so then he plays the chords, and the church falls, and he dies in it. And I wonder if this is an unconscious suicide on his part, because he tries to commit suicide earlier on in the book when he's on the boat going through Italy, and he kind of denies it, but it's the people around him saying because he wakes up in a hospital bed, he's like, oh, what happened? Did Esme kill herself? And he's they're like, no, you tried to kill yourself. So I wonder, they say he doesn't understand Italian, but I think they include the text, so you could translate it if you knew the language. And considering that he's probably been in Italy for a little while at this point, there are some words that are fairly obvious that I think he would be able to understand. And if he doesn't understand those, he'd understand when the walls first started to shake that hey, maybe he just stopped playing and leave. So part of me is led to believe that this is how this is a suicide to a certain extent. He knew what was going to happen, or if he didn't know what was going to happen, he knew what was happening as it was happening. He could have stopped and ran, but he chose to go out playing his music. And that closing line of this work that he wrote is highly praised but not often spoken about. Going back to this whole idea of being recognized, is this work noted purely because of the writing itself, or because a man died playing it, a church fell on him while he was playing it, and is there a reason why it's not often played? Would Stanley want his work to be played, or is he just happy with it being remembered fondly? These are just questions that, are very nebulous and also, really fun to speculate about. And yeah, just some closing remarks. Stanley mentions that about Esme's death. She has last time he sees her is in Rome. She abandons him for, I think for Basil, and he sees her with a sore on her lip, And then later on, he encounters Basil like a certain amount of time later. It's not really made clear. And Basil's like, "Do you know where Esme is? Like, I have this role for her in this like adaptation, this film adaptation of Dante's Inferno." And he's like, "Oh, she died because she kissed the foot of Saint Peter's statue, and it infected the scar on her lip, and she died from it." But like, I don't understand how he would know this. So like, I'm sort of led to believe that he's lying to Basil, and that she's either a lie or like something like that, or he's just convinced himself that she died because he wants nothing to do with Stanley. That's how I interpret it. Let me know what you think, if you have any other theories, or if I'm missing something crucial, because I just don't understand how he would figure this out, because it seems like he's done with Esme. Like, their lives go in separate directions, so I don't understand how he would figure all this stuff out on his own. But yeah, that was like a really weird question, and I really love the character of Esme, and I feel like that would be kind of anticlimactic end for her. So like, in my head at least, I think it's just Stanley lying, either because he's bitter and like just wants Basil to feel bad and to give up on Esme, or like for another reason he's just convincing himself that he's dead because she wants nothing to do with him. And then one last lingering question I have is with the comparisons to Ulysses. People are pretty adamant that Gaddis wasn't influenced by Ulysses. I think Gaddis himself said that he hadn't read James Joyce's Ulysses until after he'd written Recognitions. And although this book absolutely stands on its own, it's not like a ripoff of Ulysses by any means. Like, there are some really obvious parallels to Ulysses that like really gives me pause to think like, oh, he knew nothing about Ulysses before he wrote the Recognitions. Mainly in Wyatt, and like that small Odyssey parallel that's towards the end of the book. Mainly because Ulysses is also an adaptation of the Odyssey, and a reinterpretation to a certain extent of the Odyssey. And like one of the main characters in Ulysses is Stephen Dedalus, and towards the end of the book, Wyatt changes his name to Stephen before he goes on his Odyssey, and both characters are artists. Well, Stephen Dedalus is a writer, Wyatt is a painter, but there are like some really obvious parallels that like really gives me pause when I hear like people say he wasn't influenced by Ulysses very much, or like Gaddis never read Ulysses. Like those parallels are like a little too coincidental for me to really to look over them. It's just interesting. I have to do more research on it, but if you have any insights on it, let me know, because it's feels very convenient to a certain extent. And yeah, I've been sitting here for like an hour at this point. I imagine this video will be shorter when I edit it down, but thank you if you made it this far into the video. I check out my other videos if you want to, and yeah, check out my friends Colors Wonderland and Drunzo, and let me know what you think about the Recognitions and my video and my interpretation of it. Obviously up to discussion. If I'm wrong about a lot of things, let me know. And yeah, maybe we'll do some more Gaddis at some point, because this book is pretty incredible. And I think I might do a Hemingway video next for my next video. We'll see though. I've been sitting here for a long time. So yeah, check out my other stuff. Thank you and goodbye.